The moment my boss said, this project would be finished twice as fast if my son ran it, the room went unnaturally still. Not awkward still. Not polite still. The kind of still where everyone stops breathing at the same time. I was seated halfway down the long walnut table, my notebook open, pen perfectly aligned along its spine. 12 board members, 1 founder, 1 heir, and me, head of operations, lead architect on the project in question, and apparently expendable. No one looked directly at me, but I felt every shift of attention tilt in my direction. My boss, Andrew Cross, folded his hands as if he had just commented on the weather. Neutral, reasonable, almost kind. It was none of those things. I'd been here long enough to know the difference between an observation and a verdict. His son, Matthew, sat to my left in a tailored suit that still smelled new. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His confidence had never required proof. When our eyes met, he smiled. Not wide, not openly cruel. Just a small tightening at the corners of his mouth, like he already knew the ending of a story the rest of us were still pretending to write. I felt the resignation letter before I reached for it. The envelope rested inside my notebook, folded once, crisply. I'd printed it at home at midnight, the night before the meeting. Not because I planned to quit, at least not yet, but because I'd learned something important over the years. When people start talking about speed instead of accuracy, replacement is already underway. Andrew continued, Kelly is thorough, but this phase requires momentum. He didn't use the word slow. He didn't need to. The implication hung there, sharp and deliberate. Thorough had become a liability. Precision, a weakness. Matthew leaned back, arms loose, relaxed in a way that only someone insulated from consequence can be. He didn't look at the project brief, didn't ask a question. He already owned the outcome in his mind. I stood. The sound of my chair legs against the floor was louder than it should have been. Andrew paused, surprised. Not by disagreement, but by the interruption. That was new. If you want your son to take over, I said calmly, my voice steady enough to surprise even me, then this belongs to you. I placed the envelope on the table. One motion, no flourish. Matthew's smile sharpened. Across from us, the founder, Richard Hale, finally moved. He had been silent the entire exchange, fingers steepled, eyes unreadable. He studied the letter, then Andrew, then me. All right, Richard said. Hand the project to your son. Andrew exhaled, victorious. Then Richard turned slightly in his chair, his gaze locking onto mine. Kelly, my office. 10 minutes, bring the letter. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. And somehow, that unsettled everyone more than the resignation itself. I walked out of the boardroom with the envelope still warm from my touch, and the distinct sense that whatever waited behind Richard Hale's door had very little to do with whether I still had a job. When I joined Crossfield Solutions 8 years earlier, I'd been handed a folding desk, a secondhand laptop, and a backlog everyone else wanted to forget. I took it anyway, sorted it, fixed it, built systems that quietly saved contracts no one ever thanked me for preserving. Andrew barely noticed me then. He didn't have to. I wasn't in his way. That changed 3 years ago when Matthew joined the company under the title Strategic Associate. No department, no metrics, just access. Andrew introduced him with a proud clap on the back and a speech about fresh energy and modern instincts. Matthew called my work solid the first week. The word landed wrong. It always does when spoken downward. After that, the shifts were subtle. Meetings rescheduled without me. Reports revised after I submitted them. Slides I built presented without attribution. When I asked questions, I was told I was being territorial. When I warned about risk, I was told I was being negative. By the time I realized Andrew wasn't just preparing his son to lead, but preparing me to fail, it was already well underway. Richard Hale's office overlooked the harbor, all glass and light. He didn't motion for me to sit. Why now? He asked, nodding at the envelope. Because today made something clear. I said. This wasn't about speed. It was about ownership. And silence would have made me complicit in what comes next. He studied me for a long moment. What do you think comes next, Kelly? I met his eyes. A mess someone else will have to clean up. A flicker, interest, not surprise. Richard glanced toward the window, then back at me. Good, he said quietly. Then let's talk about what happens when the person who actually understands the system steps outside of it. And just like that, I realized my resignation wasn't the end of my influence. It was the beginning of something Andrew and his son had never anticipated. Richard didn't invite me to sit. Instead, he walked past me and poured himself a glass of water from the decanter near the window, his back turned as if giving me space, or testing whether I would fill the silence. You understand what you just did, he said finally, not a question. I do, I replied. I removed myself from the narrative Andrew's been building. He turned then, studying me the way engineers study stress fractures, quietly, without judgment, measuring how much pressure something can take before it breaks. Andrew believes momentum solves everything, Richard said. He's wrong. Momentum without structure just accelerates failure. I stayed quiet. I had learned that people in his position didn't want reassurance. They wanted precision. The board doesn't know the full picture, he continued. They see timelines and confidence. They don't see dependencies. They don't see what unravels when the wrong person cuts corners. And Matthew will, I said. Not out of malice, out of ignorance. Richard nodded once. That's what concerns me. He moved behind his desk and finally gestured for me to sit. Only then. You printed this letter before the meeting, he said, tapping the envelope. Why? Because I've seen this before, I almost said. Because women who resist are labeled obstacles. Because if I waited, they would shove me out and call it restructuring. Instead, I said, because I wanted control over when the story changed. A faint smile touched his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. Good answer, he said. Here's mine. I'm accepting your resignation. Publicly. My chest tightened, just slightly. But privately, he continued, you are not leaving this project. He opened a slim folder on his desk and slid it toward me. Inside, a contract header. Independent Operational Consultant, Hailstone Group. Hailstone was our largest external partner, the one Andrew never interfered with, the one that answered directly to Richard. You'll review the entire project structure from Hailstone's side, Richard said. No internal politics, no crossfield reporting chains. You'll send your findings to me. And Andrew? I asked. He'll think he's won, Richard said evenly, which will make him careless. I didn't hesitate. And Matthew? He'll run fast, Richard said, and fast runners trip when the ground isn't level. I walked out of his office 10 minutes later with a signed short-term consulting agreement and a timeline that suddenly made sense. My resignation email went out company-wide before lunch. Polite, gracious, non-confrontational. Andrew replied within minutes. Wishing you the best, Kelly. I know this couldn't have been an easy decision. It was the first lie of many. Hailstone's offices were 3 floors above a co-working space near the river. Clean, efficient, quiet. No glass walls, no performative meetings. Just whiteboards filled with equations and people who asked questions before offering opinions. Emma Shaw, Hailstone's director, shook my hand firmly. I won't insult you with pleasantries, she said. We've been flagging inconsistencies in Crossfield's reports for 6 months. Richard thinks you know why. I do, I said, but we'll need to confirm it carefully. She handed me a key card and a thick binder. We already pulled what Andrew sent over last quarter, she said. You'll recognize what doesn't belong. I did, within the first hour. Workflow diagrams altered just enough to break regulatory sequencing. Risk buffers removed and relabeled as optional redundancies. Performance metrics smoothed, peaks exaggerated, valleys erased. I found my own language repurposed without context. Draft notes I'd never finalized, presented as implementation proof. On the second day, I requested server-side logs. Emma raised an eyebrow. Expecting something? I am, I said, and I hope to be wrong. I wasn't. Access timestamps trace back to Matthew's credentials. Overrides requested and approved under Andrew's authorization. Files copied, modified, re-uploaded. Version histories deliberately flattened. This wasn't enthusiasm. It wasn't ambition. It was falsification. On the third day, Matthew's first project update went out. Company-wide email. Subject line, accelerated progress achieved. Andrew forwarded it to the board, CCing Richard. Emma watched me read it. He's claiming a 2-week reduction based on that revised pipeline, she said. That revision violates 3 client contracts, I replied, and 1 federal compliance requirement. She stared at me. Then why isn't anyone stopping him? Because speed looks like leadership, I said, until it collapses. That afternoon, I sent Richard a concise report. No opinions, no accusations, just discrepancies, timestamps, and attached documentation. He replied with 1 sentence. Keep going. By the end of the week, Matthew's momentum had triggered something no one at Crossfield noticed, an automated risk alert at Hailstone. It wasn't dramatic. No alarms. Just a quiet flag, generated by a system I'd helped design years earlier. The kind people ignore, until it's too late. I looked at Emma and felt the weight of inevitability settle. Andrew thought he was replacing me. What he was really doing was removing the only person who knew where the ground was thin. And now, it was starting to crack. By the second week, the cracks were no longer theoretical. They showed up in small, inconvenient places, missed acknowledgments, delayed confirmations, questions from partners that shouldn't have needed to be asked. The kind of friction that people dismiss as growing pains when leadership is too invested in the illusion of progress. At Hailstone, we didn't have that luxury. Emma placed a printout on my desk Tuesday morning. Client Delta flagged a discrepancy in delivery sequencing, she said. They're asking why the pilot phase skipped a validation checkpoint. I didn't need to look at the page to know the answer. That checkpoint was part of the workflow Matthew removed, I said. He relabeled it as redundant. Emma frowned. It's not redundant. It's mandatory. I know, I said. That's why it existed. By midday, 3 more flags appeared. Different clients, same pattern. Steps cut, dependencies rerouted. Risk absorbed on paper instead of managed in reality. What made it worse wasn't the mistakes. It was how cleanly they had been dressed up. Matthew wasn't sloppy. He was meticulous. About presentation. His reports were glossy, decisive, filled with confident language and numbers that rounded upward in exactly the way boards like. Every success attributed to decisive leadership. Every unresolved issue framed as legacy drag. My name appeared once in those documents, under a footnote labeled Prior Framework Limitations. Emma saw it before I mentioned anything. That's deliberate, she said quietly. Yes, I replied, and it's escalating. That afternoon, Richard requested a call. Not a video meeting, not an email, a call. I assume you've seen the latest flags, he said without greeting. I have, I replied. They're connected. How much damage? None yet, I said, but the window is closing. He exhaled through his nose. Andrew is pushing for a press release next week. My jaw tightened. Announcing what? Accelerated rollout, Richard said, based on Matthew's revised projection. That rollout will breach at least 1 compliance threshold, I said. Possibly 2. Silence stretched across the line. Then Richard said, document everything. Hailstone's compliance team will formalize the audit once we have pattern confirmation. You already have a pattern, I said. Yes, he replied. But Andrew will claim interpretation error. We need inevitability. I understood. People like Andrew didn't respond to warning. They responded to exposure. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. On Thursday, an internal Crossfield memo leaked, quietly, almost accidentally, into Hailstone's shared workspace. Emma forwarded it to me with a single line. "Is this real?" It was. Andrew had approved a temporary bypass on a federally monitored contract, not a suspension. A conditional adjustment. His language, his signature. Matthew's efficiency gain, written in confident bullet points. It took me less than 5 minutes to trace the origin of the supporting data. It was mine. A draft from 2 years earlier. Marked incomplete. Never approved. Matthew had copied it, changed the timestamps, and inserted it as evidence of real-world performance. He hadn't even fully understood it, just enough to make it look convincing. That was the moment my anger sharpened into something colder. This wasn't ambition anymore. It was fraud. I called Emma. "We need Marcus." Marcus Klein was Hailstone's compliance lead. Former regulator, exacting, unimpressed by confidence. When he arrived, I laid out the evidence without commentary. Logs, versions, authorization chains. He read silently, jaw tightening. "This isn't aggressive leadership," he said finally. "This is intentional misrepresentation." "Yes," I said, "and it's systemic." He nodded once. "I'll trigger a formal audit. That puts us on record." "What does that mean for Crossfield?" Emma asked. Marcus looked up. "It means their board will receive findings they can't redefine." That evening, my phone buzzed. A message from Jake, a project analyst I'd worked closely with for years. "Kelly, are you watching this?" I replied immediately. "What happened?" "Matthew presented today." The board applauded. Andrew looked triumphant. My fingers hovered over the screen. "Any questions?" A pause. Then, "Helen asked about missing validation steps. Andrew said those were tied to your old framework and had been streamlined." I closed my eyes. "Did anyone challenge it?" I typed. Another pause. Longer this time. "No." The silence told me everything. People weren't convinced. They were intimidated. The audit findings were sent the following morning. Not leaked, not dramatized, delivered. By afternoon, Richard forwarded me a single message. "Emergency board session scheduled. You are not invited." I didn't need to be. Jake called an hour later, whispering, "Kelly, it's bad." I listened as voices rose in the background. Andrew's, tight, defensive. Matthew's, higher, frantic. Then Richard's voice cut through, calm and sharp. "Explain why Hailstone's logs trace falsified data to your authorization." A pause. Papers rustling. Andrew stammered something about misunderstanding. Richard didn't raise his voice. "Intent doesn't matter when the outcome is manipulation." I leaned back in my chair, heart steady, breath slow. For the first time since I stood up in that boardroom, I wasn't bracing myself for impact. I was watching gravity do its work. Andrew had removed me to speed up the story. What he hadn't realized was that I was the only one who knew how it ended. The board meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. I wasn't in the room, but pieces of it reached me in fragments. Through Jake's hushed phone call, through an email Emma received from Hailstone's legal team, through the tone of Richard's brief update that came late that afternoon. Short, precise, controlled, proceeding as expected, remain available, that was all. Jake called once the meeting adjourned. He didn't bother lowering his voice this time. "Kelly, I've never seen anything like it." I closed my laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Start from the beginning." "There were charts," he said. So many charts. Andrew kept trying to explain them away. Calling them drafts, calling them misaligned timestamps. Matthew tried to jump in twice. Richard shut him down both times. I could picture it. Matthew used to interrupt constantly when I spoke, confident no one would stop him. That confidence didn't survive correction. "What changed?" I asked. Helen, Jake said. She asked why the workflows Hailstone reviewed didn't match what the board had approved 6 months ago. Andrew said they'd evolved. Richard asked who authorized the evolution. And? I prompted. Jake exhaled. No one answered. According to Jake, the room shifted when Marcus Klein joined by video. No drama, no accusation, just a calm walkthrough of evidence. Logs, timestamps, authorization trails. Marcus didn't say fraud. He didn't have to. He said the discrepancies weren't accidental, Jake continued, that they showed intent to conceal performance failures by reallocating attribution. My fingers tightened slightly around my phone. And my name? I asked. A pause. Richard addressed that directly. Jake said. He said the systems being praised today were built and validated under your leadership, and that the accelerated revisions bypassed safeguards you specifically designed. I closed my eyes. For months, my work had been spoken about as if it were outdated, fragile, inferior. Now it was being named again, but accurately. What happened to Andrew? I asked. That's the part that got quiet, Jake said. Richard said Andrew would step away immediately pending a full internal investigation. HR escorted him out. And Matthew? Jake hesitated. He tried to argue, said he was following direction, that you'd refuse to adapt. And? Richard's voice came back to me through Jake's memory. Steady, unmoved. Following direction without understanding consequence is not leadership. Matthew was removed from project authority effective immediately. His access revoked. His future suddenly undefined. When the call ended, I sat there longer than I expected to. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. That evening, Richard asked me to meet him the following morning. Not at Hailstone. Not at Crossfield. A cafe near the water. Neutral ground. He was already there when I arrived, coat folded beside him, coffee untouched. You handled this cleanly, he said once I sat down. I documented facts, I replied. That's all. That's more than most people do, he said. They hesitate. You didn't. I stirred my tea slowly. Because hesitation was already being used against me. Richard nodded. Andrew counted on your restraint. Yes, I said. He always did. He slid a folder across the table, thicker than the first. This is not a return offer, he said before I could open it. Crossfield no longer deserves your loyalty. Inside was a long-term consulting agreement. Direct, independent. My name listed not as support, but as authority. You'll operate outside the company, he continued. You'll design, audit, and approve systems that Crossfield relies on, but cannot alter. I looked up. Andrew built his power by controlling internal narratives. Exactly, Richard said, and they collapsed the moment they left that ecosystem. I sat with that. The vindication, subtle and restrained. What's the message here? I asked. To the board? That accuracy outlasts influence, Richard replied, and that systems built on truth don't break when personalities do. I signed the contract 2 days later. Andrew's termination became official by then. Matthew's role quietly dissolved. No announcement, no apology. The company reframed the narrative quickly. Strategic realignment, leadership transition, commitment to integrity. I watched it from a distance, no longer inside the machinery. Jake visited me at Hailstone that Friday. He looked lighter. People are talking, he said. Not just about Andrew, about you. I smiled faintly. Let them. They're saying the project didn't stall when you left, he added. It failed. That was inevitable, I said. They removed structure, not me. As he left, I turned back to my screen, reviewing a system diagram. One Crossfield would rely on for years without knowing where my influence ended and theirs began. For the first time, my work wasn't subject to reinterpretation. It simply existed. And that, I realized, was power Andrew never understood. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, the way consequences usually do when no one is rushing to dramatize them. Crossfield's official announcement came on a Monday morning. A carefully worded internal memo about organizational restructuring and temporary leadership adjustments. Andrew's name appeared once. Matthew's didn't appear at all. By noon, the trading partners knew more than the memo said. Hailstone's compliance notice triggered secondary reviews from 2 external auditors. Not because they were suspicious, but because protocol demanded it. Once that chain begins, it doesn't stop for sentiment or seniority. It stops only when the math does. I felt the shift before anyone told me about it. Emails from partner firms addressed directly to me instead of going through Crossfield's executives. Questions became detailed again, precise, real, the way professionals speak when they no longer trust filtered information. Emma noticed it too. "They're treating you like a fixed point," she said one afternoon as we reviewed the first stabilized projections since the audit. "They always did," I replied. "They just weren't allowed to say it out loud." By midweek, Crossfield's redesigned workflow collapsed entirely. Not dramatically. No system-wide outage. Just a steady accumulation of delays, reversions, emergency patches. The kind that don't make headlines, but cost trust. Jake called me after hours. "They reinstated 3 checkpoints you built," he said. Quietly. Same structure. New labels. I almost laughed. Almost. "They can change the names," I said. "They can't change the logic." The board meeting that followed was closed door. No consultants invited. No junior staff present. When Richard called me afterward, his tone was measured. "They've asked me to accelerate the long-term external oversight," he said. "I assumed they would," I replied. "They didn't frame it as oversight," he added. "They framed it as dependency." That word mattered. Dependency meant they no longer believed they could operate independently of the systems I designed. They had pushed me out, measured the void, and recalculated. "And Andrew?" I asked. "He's contesting the termination," Richard said calmly, "claiming miscommunication." "Will it hold?" "No," Richard replied. "The logs are immutable." I let that settle. Andrew had always relied on influence, on relationships, on confidence, none of which mattered when timestamps didn't lie. Matthew tried a different approach. I found out through a LinkedIn message request that sat unanswered for hours before I noticed it. His name, his photo, same rehearsed smile. "Kelly, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Would appreciate a chance to talk." I didn't respond. An hour later, another message. We were under a lot of pressure. None of this was personal. That one stung more than I expected. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed how little he understood. To Matthew, personal meant emotional. To me, personal meant structural. The erasure of accountability. The rewriting of history. I archived the conversation without replying. 2 days later, a recruiter reached out on behalf of Crossfield. I declined. Not angrily, not performatively. I forwarded the email to Richard with a single line. "Let's keep the boundaries clear." He responded with approval. Hailstone finalized the extended contract by the end of the week. The scope expanded beyond Crossfield. 2 additional firms, 1 regulatory review board liaison. Emma printed the agreement and slid it across the table. "You're aware," she said, "that this makes you the person Crossfield answers to, without being able to influence you." "I'm aware," I said. "That's the point." That Friday, I ran into Andrew unexpectedly. Not at a meeting, not at a conference, a grocery store near my apartment. He looked smaller somehow, less certain of his space. When he recognized me, he stiffened. "Kelly," he said carefully, "I didn't expect—" "I know," I replied. "You rarely did." He swallowed. "You should understand, I was doing what I thought was best for the company." I studied him. Really studied him. "You were doing what was best for your son," I said. The company was incidental. That's not fair, he snapped. No, I said evenly. It's accurate. He searched my face, perhaps expecting satisfaction, gloating, vindication. He found none. I warned you, I continued, quietly, repeatedly. You ignored me because listening would have required you to slow down. Silence stretched between us. I hope it was worth it, I said finally. Not threatening, not cruel, simply factual. I walked away before he could respond. That night, I sat at my desk reviewing a series of new system models. Clean, unfiltered, stable. Work that didn't ask me to defend its existence. For the first time in years, my energy wasn't being redirected toward survival. It was being invested in construction. Andrew had built his legacy on visibility. I was building mine on infrastructure. And infrastructure, I had learned, always outlives ego. The appeal failed quietly. No press release. No final statement. Just a formal notice circulated internally, confirming that Andrew Cross's termination had been upheld in full. Cause established. Due process followed. Case closed. I found out the same way I'd found out about most things lately. Indirectly. Jake called during his lunch break, voice low but firm. It's official, he said. HR wrapped it this morning. No severance. I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. And Matthew? Jake hesitated. He resigned last week. Gave notice. Didn't say where he's going. I imagine he won't, I said. When the call ended, I sat at my desk for a long moment, hands resting flat on the table. I didn't feel relief the way I'd expected. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of victory. What I felt instead was distance. The kind that comes when something that once consumed your energy finally loosens its grip. At Hailstone, the work had shifted again. Not just volume, tone. People trusted the process now. Conversations weren't defensive. Questions weren't loaded. Emma stopped by mid-afternoon with 2 coffees and a look I'd come to recognize as relief. The board at Crossfield signed off on the new oversight framework, she said. Unanimously. I took the cup she offered. They didn't have another choice. No, she agreed. But they could have delayed. They didn't. That mattered more than it sounded like. Delays were how institutions protected pride. Moving quickly meant fear had finally reached the right places. Richard wants your input on the next phase, Emma added. Strategic, not technical. I nodded. Send me the outline. She lingered for a moment before leaving. You should know, she said. People here talk about you the way they talk about load-bearing walls. Like nothing flashy, but everything collapses without them. I smiled, genuinely this time. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. Crossfield wasn't silent, exactly, but it was restrained. Emails slowed. Inquiries stopped carrying undertones. No one tried to renegotiate the terms we'd set. They were careful now. Careful meant learning. Richard invited me to lunch near the end of the week, not to discuss work. Or rather, not only work. I underestimated how long you carried that weight, he said once we were seated. Not the technical part, the social one. It's easy to miss, I replied. Especially if you're not the one absorbing it. Yes, he said quietly. That's the part I regret. I set my fork down. You gave me space when it mattered. I gave you distance, he corrected, and I knew it would hurt in the moment. It did, I said honestly, but it worked. He nodded once, accepting that. The board wants to issue a formal apology. I looked up. Public? Internal, Richard said. Documented. Attributed. I considered it, then shook my head. Not necessary. It matters, he said. No, I replied gently. What matters is that the system changed, not what it says about me. He studied me for a moment, then smiled. You always did understand the difference. That evening, I passed the Crossfield building on my walk home. Lights still on in half the offices. People inside working late. For years, that had been me. I thought about the hours, the nights, the compromises I had labeled professionalism because I didn't have another word for them at the time. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt clarity. At home, I drafted notes for the final phase of the Hailstone rollout. A system built to make manipulation difficult, transparency unavoidable, accountability embedded. It wasn't personal. It was preventative. Jake sent a message later that night. "The team's different now," he wrote. "People ask why things work, not just who approved them." I responded after a moment. That's how it should have been. As I set my phone down, I realized something important. Andrew's removal hadn't fixed the culture on its own. Matthew's absence hadn't magically created integrity. What changed was exposure. The quiet certainty that someone somewhere understood the system well enough to see through shortcuts. That presence didn't need to sit in the boardroom. It just needed to exist. And for the first time in my career, I wasn't fighting to be heard. I was being relied on, without being visible enough to threaten anyone. The irony didn't escape me. By stepping away, I'd finally stepped into influence. And the story Andrew had tried to rush past me? It was ending on terms he never took the time to understand. The last email from Crossfield came on a quiet Tuesday morning. No urgency. No subtext. Just a confirmation that the final phase of the oversight framework had been approved and implemented without revision. I read it once, archived it, and didn't think about it again. That was how I knew it was over. Not because they admitted fault, not because apologies were made, but because the system no longer needed my presence to function correctly. It needed my logic, and that was already embedded. A week later, Richard stepped back as founder. Planned, orderly, boring in the way real succession should be. The board appointed an interim leadership committee instead of a single figurehead. No charismatic savior, no fast talker with a vision deck. Just accountability divided among people who knew the cost of pretending. When the announcement circulated, Jake texted me a single line. "It finally feels quiet in here." I understood exactly what he meant. I didn't attend Richard's farewell gathering. He didn't expect me to. Instead, he left a note with Emma to pass along. "You did what institutions rarely allow people to do. Fix them without becoming them. Thank you." I folded the note and placed it in a drawer with old system diagrams and project drafts. Finish things, close chapters. That afternoon, I walked along the river near Hailstone's office, watching the water curl around the pylons. Infrastructure again. Always unnoticed. Always essential. For a long time, I had believed endurance was strength, that professionalism meant absorbing pressure without complaint, without consequence, that if I stayed steady long enough, people would eventually do the right thing. I had been wrong about that. What I learned instead was simpler and harder to accept. People don't change because you endure. They change when the truth becomes unavoidable. Andrew never thought he was doing anything wrong. In his mind, he was accelerating progress, protecting legacy, securing continuity. Matthew believed confidence was competence, that proximity to power substituted for understanding. Neither woke up planning to dismantle safeguards or falsify data. They just never slowed down long enough to learn what those safeguards protected. And I let myself become convenient. Not invisible. Convenient. Easy to reframe. Easy to displace. Easy to credit when things went well and quietly sideline when they didn't. My mistake wasn't trusting them. It was trusting that patience alone would be enough to protect the work. At Hailstone, my role expanded again, but gently, sustainably. I supervised 2 project architects, both early in their careers. On their first week, one of them asked how to survive corporate politics without becoming bitter. I thought about it before answering. "Build things that tell the truth," I said. "And keep your name attached to them. Quietly, if you must, but unmistakably." They nodded, uncertain. I recognized that look. Understanding always lags experience. A month later, I ran into Matthew again, this time at a conference. Smaller venue, less spectacle. He spotted me across the room and hesitated. Then he walked over. "Kelly," he said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. "I didn't understand what you built," he continued. "I thought direction was enough." I met his eyes. He looked different, less rehearsed, more cautious. "Direction without comprehension is dangerous," I said. "You learned that the hard way." "Yes," he agreed. "So did my father." We stood there in silence for a moment. "I hope you're doing well," he said finally. "I am," I replied, and meant it. He nodded once and walked away. That was closure enough. On my last day of the quarter, I reviewed the performance summary Hailstone circulated to its partners. My name appeared exactly where it should, attached to architecture, not personality. Outcomes, not promises. That night, I closed my laptop and stepped onto the balcony of my apartment. The city hummed below, indifferent and alive. I thought back to the boardroom where this began. The stillness, the assumptions, the resignation letter I'd raised not as surrender, but as boundary. Andrew thought he was handing the project to his son. What he really handed away was control over the truth. I didn't win by staying. I won by refusing to be rewritten. The work continued without me having to explain my presence. The systems held because they were built to. And my life, finally, moved forward without the constant calculation of how small I needed to be to remain useful. That was the real resolution. Not revenge, not recognition. Freedom. And it turned out to be faster than anything Andrew ever promised.